So here's the video regarding writing introductions in a full essay, because we've been doing body paragraphs up until this point, and so this is how we're going to discuss introductions. And we talked about this a little bit when we were talking about um, the rubric, but here's your explicit introduction, or here's your explicit understanding of like introductions. And so we got to make sure that we're aware that when we're talking about introductions, a lot of people just say like, oh, the first paragraph that happens in an essay. And they say like, oh yeah, we've got to hook the reader. But what does that even mean, or what does that look like? So let's take a look at when I say an introduction, these are the elements that you need to keep in mind. So if you want a successful introduction, the following needs to happen. Number one, you provide context for your argument. So what that means is that is there any necessary background for me to know before you get started, right? So like if you're going to talk to me about your grandmother, perhaps do I need to know a little bit about your grandmother? Is this going to be is this an abnormal relationship? Meaning like, are you going to be talking about your friendship? That's not abnormal, but oftentimes people write about family members. So like give some context like of if this is someone that you're not related to, when did you first meet them? And so like providing context means that you provide any necessary background if it's needed. Okay, so that's the first thing an introduction should do. Not the first, but one of the things. Also is that it attracts the audience's attention. So that's what we typically hear when we see, that's typically what we hear when people say like the hook, right? So a hook is something that gains their attention. But you don't want to do this in a way that's false, like saying like, look out behind you, there's a murderer. Yeah, that might get their attention, but is that really what your paper is going to be about? But so yes, you want to attract your readers' attention. And then finally, the introduction prepares your audience for the thesis. Okay, and the thesis is your main argument that you are making throughout your paper. Okay, so in this case, your introduction should lead me to or transition nicely into the thesis. Like, give me some background, catch my attention to help prepare me for the relationship that you are going to discuss and the impact that it has. So if your thesis, or excuse me, if your introduction doesn't do any of these, totally bad. It's ineffective. If it doesn't do one of these, still ineffective. If it does one of these, so taking a look then about like what the expectations are for your introduction. So you've got a good opening, so good meaning like catches the attention, and it introduces the reader to a single personal relationship. So what that means is we are looking for you to have context. This does require you to provide some context. Who is this person? What is the context of your relationship? If necessary, do you need to tell me how you met? If necessary, do you need to tell me how long you've been in a relationship with this person? And then the other thing, the last couple ones are like clear impact of the relationship, so making it clear about the importance, what this person has done for you, what they have taught you, and then identifiable main idea or central focus, which we have already discussed, is the thesis. Okay, and so that's not what I want. So this is, if you want to meet standards, we're asking you to do all of these things, all right? So let's take a look at the ways many people use introductions or think that introductions should be done. So cliche is not good. We don't want cliche introductions because the reason things become cliche is because they are overdone. And when they are overdone, that means that they have lost their effectiveness. When something is overdone, people get tired of it. They start to ignore it. I mean, think of any meme that you've seen on the internet. Those become so cliche in a matter of a week that people roll their eyes then, oftentimes, when they see stuff like that. So cliche is not good simply because it's so overdone that it loses its importance. And one of those is definitely the rhetorical question. And we talked about that a little bit in class here. When we were talking about class, or the introductions in class. Rhetorical questions, often the reason that rhetorical questions, not only are they cliche and they lose their effectiveness, but oftentimes people ask a question that the reader does not even care about. You know, like, have you ever heard of polio? Like, who cares? Like, no, I've never even thought about polio. Like, this is not something that's on my mind all of the time. Or like, do you have a best friend? Yes. Moving on. Like, it's not something they care about or they care thinking about at this time. And also, the other thing that's problematic is that without background, the rhetorical question doesn't seem to make sense. So like, if you ask somebody, have you ever heard of a flesh-eating virus? Like, where am I going? I thought this paragraph or I thought this essay was going to be about relationships, but instead you're now frightening the butts out of me because you're talking about flesh-eating virus. So rhetorical questions are problematic. They are cliche, overused, lose their effectiveness. You oftentimes ask questions that your reader doesn't care about or doesn't care to think about. And even if it is a good question, without the relevance or the importance of the rest of the paper, without context, they don't make sense. So you don't start the paper with a rhetorical question. Boo! No rhetorical questions. The other thing that people oftentimes point out or try to use is what's called the definition. That's literally when you go to a dictionary and cite the definition, right? So like, oftentimes it's unclear why you're even providing that definition. So if I were to say like, Oxford's English Dictionary defines polio as, like, okay, like that seems out of context. Or it just seems like mundane. Best friend is defined by Longman's Dictionary as someone blank, blank, blank. Like, are you kidding me? Like, that is not going to catch my attention. If anything, I'm going to be like, wow, this is lame. They're reading the dictionary to me. So in this example about the nuclear war, again, or nuclear power, like, why is this relevant? I have no idea. So the definition, looking up a definition in a dictionary, not what you want to do. The quotation. Ah, geez. This is another tried and true cliche introduction that people try to use the quotation because they think it's a really good start. So it can be, but it faces the same issues as the other ones. Like, why is this quote even being used? Without context, I don't understand. So if I were to say, noted physicist Albert Einstein once said, polio is going to kill us all. Like, okay, first of all, why is Albert Einstein even saying this? Second of all, kill us all. You're freaking your people out. Like, the quotation is not good. Taking a look at this example, famous horror author Stephen King once said, monsters and ghosts are real. They live inside us and sometimes they win. Again, pretty ominous, kind of frightening, concerning. Now, I don't think you want to scare your reader. The quotation, again, is oftentimes not a good place to start. So what are some better intros that we can use? So these are techniques that you can use that would be important or would be more beneficial than these other cliche ones. Okay, so first of all, background information. So depending on your topic, like historical information might be relevant, general contextual information, like background between you and the person that you have the relationship with, or any sort of data that helps inform the reader. So any type of information that provides that background. This sometimes might be like, you can look it up, right? So if I were to provide, like if I was going to write about my grandmother, then I could provide some data or historical information and talk about like between the years of 1910 and 1930, more than 300,000 children were affected with polio. 1/3 of those children ended up dying. Like, that's providing some context if I wanted to talk about my grandmother and what she experienced. Or I could provide some general background about like what she and I did together, or something that she and I shared. I could talk about some background about some context, or I'm sorry, not context, of diabetes. But like, even outside of this assignment, like if I were to ask you to write an essay or an argument or anything about another topic, you can do some background information and do some research. You absolutely can do that. And so it all depends on what your topic is. And the providing background would be good, especially if you have a very complicated topic. All right. So providing background, a paragraph of background that leads to your thesis would definitely be good. Another one that you could use is what's called the description. This is where you have a little bit of creativity that you can use. And so this is where you literally describe something. You can describe a place, you can describe a person or an object. And what that does is that it can inform the reader of an idea that you're having, like or the idea of your paper, or it can create a certain mood. Right? So if I wanted to describe the room that my grandmother's bedroom, then I could go along the lines and I could say, like, I could describe all of the jewelry that was hanging by her mirror, how it sparkled when or it was iridescent. Oh, see what I did there? How it had an iridescent shine when the sun hit it. That her bed was unusually low because she couldn't crawl up into the bed, and how it was because of her polio. And so, like, what I could be providing is like this very, very, like, a woman that is proud and self-sufficient, if I'm talking about like the bed that was specially made for her so that she wouldn't need help getting in and out of bed. So again, like, and if I wanted to describe my grandmother even further, I could describe her, right? And how the wrinkles that were set in her face weren't as deep as the wrinkles in her elbow that was paralyzed, and constantly she could never straighten her arm out. So I could describe that to set the mood of how I want you to feel a certain way about my grandmother, right? So if I wanted you to fear my grandmother, I could say like her horrifying smile, or her smile looked like that of a clown's with red lipstick that went on the outside of her lips. Like if I wanted you to get freaked out and disgusted by her, I could do that and use the description to do that. But again, all of this needs to lead to my thesis. The other thing you could do is what's called the example. And this is very similar to the description. But this is where you are actually talking about something specific. So like a specific event or a current event that you could be discussing. Maybe it could even be hypothetical. So like if you want to use the example, so the difference between a description and an example is that the description is talking about not necessarily event. It could be a place, a person, an object. It's typically a thing that you're describing. An example would be like potentially an event that you would be describing very briefly. No problem. So depending on it, like this is a time also where you could use the word you, because the example, you're trying to get them to feel a certain thing so that you could use the word you here. And I'll show you what that looks like. Another one is the incident. Similar to the example, but this is a true story. So this is something that actually happened, right? So like if the example is something that just illustrates what you want to say, it could just be a current event that hasn't happened to you or the person that you're discussing. It could be hypothetical. It doesn't have to be real. The incident typically is real. This is a true story that happened. This definitely would be helpful during some papers because it adds credibility. And again, you can totally use first person. So like, if I wanted you to feel like my grandmother was supportive, I might talk to you about I might start my introduction with when I was first diagnosed with diabetes and how my grandmother treated me. So like, because she has diabetes, not to mention she was afflicted with polio, but how her behavior towards me was very comforting in that moment. And so like, again, it kind of like, it not only builds credibility, but also develops a mood. So again, the example is different than an incident because the incident is real. The example is something that's technically not real. And then finally, the analogy. So if you're trying to, if you're making a comparison between two things, typically these things have to be unfamiliar. So like if you're dealing with a really difficult topic, you'd probably want to compare that to something less less difficult to understand. So it's basically like you could compare your relationship to something else, right? So depending on the type of relationship. So if I wanted to, I could totally use the analogy to just in my introduction, if I were going to write about my basketball coach, like I discussed in class. We did not have a good relationship. And so like I could use the analogy then to describe our relationship was like a thunderstorm that or a thunderstorm with high winds, describe the tumultuous ways that we got along. But just like any thunderstorm, as soon as it passed, life was able to grow again. The thunderstorm allowed more or provided water for plants to grow, et cetera, and then I could make that analogy. Like even though this was a difficult relationship for me to maneuver, even though it was something that hurt me when I was on the team, I was able to get through it, and I was able to become a better person because of it. So the analogy is comparing two unlike things. All right. So, which one should I use, Miss Hain? Which one do you want me to use? Well, that totally depends on you. Depends on your topic, depends on your argument, and depends on what you want to say. None of these are better than the others when you just look at them. Some of them are better depending on the topic you're doing, depending on the relationship. But it's none of these that I would say like, this is always a good one or this is never a good one. So the way to identify whether or not you have, like which ones you should use, you should ask yourself, what do I want my reader to know before my thesis? What do I need to prepare them for in order for them to be ready for my thesis? What do I need to tell them before I get into my actual argument in my paper? And the other thing too is that you can totally combine these. Right? So if you want to do like the incident and combine that with the analogy, oh, you totally can. If you want to use the background information with the description, oh, you totally can. So like I'm going to show you some example introductions like, oh, it says these do not address the prompt you were given. They totally do. So never mind that. But anyways, let's take a look at some samples. So Cain and Abel, Brother and Doodle, Mufasa and Scar, Rosie and Caillou, Rob and Kim Kardashian. Whether fictional or real, it seems as though siblings are meant to quarrel. In fact, there are even psychological reasons for these tumultuous relationships. University of Michigan researcher Kyla Boise explains that children define themselves by being in opposition of others. Therefore, as Boise explains, siblings find themselves by being in conflict with others. Since this is the case, it makes my relationship with my younger sister all the more strange. While we haven't always been close, she has shown her dedication and love towards me when I most needed it. Because of this, I can safely say that I did not learn about myself by being in opposition of her. Instead, I owe who I am to her willingness to look through my flaws. So if you take a look at what I do, you'll notice that, I do this kind of list, and so you can kind of see this as a little bit of like examples, right? Or potentially even, a little bit of background information. So I provide some comparisons. I wouldn't necessarily call it an analogy, simply because I am talking about sibling relationships. All of these are examples of sibling relationships. So I wouldn't necessarily call it an analogy because they are not unlike. But I definitely would see, I've cited the University of Michigan to help provide some background. Look at all of these siblings, they don't get along. Even research says that siblings don't get along, and there's a reason for that. Psychologically, there's a reason for that. However, that's what makes my relationship with my sister all the more strange. And so, I've caught your attention by listing all of these relationships, all of these siblings, and you might not realize, geez, that's what this paper's doing. Look at all these relationships between siblings that they don't get along. And then it leads to, siblings typically don't get along. In fact, there's a reason they don't get along, but that's not the case. So this transition works really nicely. Since this is the case, it makes my relationship with my sister all the more strange. That's a transition that says, like, all this stuff that I just told you, all this background information that I provided, actually I'm going to contradict that. So like it prepares you and then it shifts you. So this is a good introduction to talk about the relationship between me and my sister. So here's another one. So here's another introduction to an essay. The first time you saddled up on your bike without training wheels, you immediately grasped for the person next to you, your sweaty palms waving in the air to catch anything that will keep your balance. While you might have expected to see your mother, grandfather, or even your neighbor, you were not aghast when it was your younger sibling who caught you. She believed in your infallibility, which sparked a new exuberance in you. You put your feet up on the pedals as your younger sibling pushed you down the sidewalk screaming, "Go, go, go!" This is exactly what happened to me that July in 1989. While it may have been the first time my sister came to my rescue, it most certainly would not be the last. Her support in my most trying times helped me develop a similar empathy for others. So, you'll notice that here I kind of used the example. I kind of combined example and incident because the example is kind of like this specific event that happened, and then I disclosed that this is actually something that happened to me. And so you notice that I say you, so I put you in the position of like learning to ride your bike and how your sibling helped you, and then I connect that with me, and then I state like, what did that teach me? Not necessarily that, but like my thesis tells you that like she definitely came to my rescue and she helped me develop empathy. So it's very clear moving into the thesis. And then I do believe this is the last one. Yep. So here's the last one. In late December, many anxious children wait impatiently for the arrival of their dreams, the lavish gift that would make them exorbitantly happy. However, many children's exuberant expectations lead them to disconsolate longing after they find that the gift turns out to be thickly sewn socks made specifically for the cold Minnesota winters. While the children ought to be happy for this useful present, they implore their parents to go back to bed and wait for dreams more pleasant than reality. Being an older sibling is a lot like a disappointing Christmas morning. One expects a playmate to share adventures with, only to find that the massive flesh only cries, poops, and vomits. While my younger sister sure has taught me patience, she has also taught me what a terrible Christmas morning has as well. Keep expectations low, and I'll never be disappointed. So, here, what I'm providing is like, this is it's like a description and example combined. Because I'm describing like getting up and being excited and then being horribly disappointed by getting stupid socks. And then making that I even totally missed this. Then I make the analogy comparing getting a sibling to a horrific Christmas morning. So like saying that, you think you're going to get something super awesome and then you just get something that is sad and makes you sad. So like I've created this introduction to lead you to this point. And so like notice how this thesis also doesn't say like, yeah, we've had the best relationship ever. I'm telling you that while this may not be the best, this is the most impactful relationship that I have had. That my sister taught me how to be patient. She also taught me that I better not expect too much. So these are some ways, these are some introductions that you could. So here are some examples, and there are multiple different kinds of introductions for you to use, and you should absolutely think about which ones you should use, what to compare, what would be the best for your paper. Because you can't say, Miss Hain, should I use this introduction? And I'm going to tell you, it depends on what your paper is about, what you're discussing, and what you want them to know.